largely associated, as he is here with the Ten Kings, are withheld, but not exclusively. So his powers are not simply limited. Japan is a really interesting case because the wheel of the 6 paths sometimes becomes a wheel of 10 paths. I have one here. I'll get to it if I have the time. Maybe I'll just keep flipping while I talk. And if you see it, stop me. The basic idea of 6 paths could be taken and developed. 4 more paths could be added to it. Here's one of the examples I was thinking of, where the humans are here, 人界, 恶鬼, 地狱, 出生, 修罗. So demigods, gods, and then there are 4 more at the top added to it. So it became its own kind of flexible way. And the 4 at the top are Shravakas, or voice hearers, Bodhisattvas, Buddhas, and Pracheka Buddhas. There are ways of incorporating higher beings into this kind of representation. And you see, this isn't quite a wheel anymore. I mean, it's a circle, and it's wonderful for those of you who read Chinese, Japanese, Korean. It has the character for mind, or heart, at the center. This is another reflection of the idea we saw at Baodingshan, with the figure in the center, from which emanate the 6 paths, and here the 10 paths. And this is part of a Huayan textual tradition concerning the 10 realms. Yes, we find it, but in ways that, if not unique, certainly are responses to Korean and Japanese traditions.
Do we know how these murals were actually used? You suggested that they might have been used as teaching tools. And do you see a connection between these and the transformation texts and the transformation tableau? That there's a connection.
That's a really interesting question. I'm not sure if you could hear it in the back. Is there a connection between these paintings and their actual use as a teaching device, related perhaps to performance literature, or perhaps the way other paintings we know were used in popular performances? The short answer is, for the early period, there's no direct evidence. There's a fair amount of indirect evidence, and it began with this with this Vinaya account that I read. This is how I first became interested in this. In addition to seeing some temples like this among Tibetan communities in India that have this painting. But I didn't think, I was interested in it, but then I read the parts of the Vinaya that have this story in which the Buddha instructs the monks to paint the wheel on the outside of the temples and station a preacher there and station somebody who is especially good at telling stories about karmic retribution. So, now, but that's a normative statement from the 2nd century, translated into Chinese in the 7th century, in the 8th century, translated into Tibetan in the 9th century. And yet you still find paintings following that direction. You still find people following those directions about the placement of the painting. It's a little easier, you move closer to the modern period, and you can see in both in Southeast Asia, contemporary Southeast Asia, and in areas where there are Tibetans or people from the Himalayas. I think Mongolia would be included as well, where there are teachers who use this as a standardized teaching device, and they carry a scroll around with them. You also find it in the novel Kim. This is what the great yogi, the great guru in Kim does. He actually paints this painting and then uses it as a teaching device. So it was clearly important in India and the Tibetan areas of India that Kipling was in, actually, or in the 19th and early part of the 20th century as well. So there's some examples we can get to, but they're largely suggestive. So in the book, I pay a lot of attention to the architecture of temples because it's real important whether this painting is essentially outside the temple and anybody can go up to it, or whether it's inside the holiest of holies in the temple. It's rarely the holiest of holies. It's always on the outside. Yes.
Did you find among the Donghua manuscripts the same type of the use of paintings along with the storytelling of the Buddha's life or the scriptures?
That would be probably Professor Chance's. Chance would be in the best position to answer that because the usual explanation, and perhaps it's advanced since I last read the material many years ago, the usual explanation is that there is one or two set of paintings among the Dunhuang manuscripts having to do with Raudraksha and Shariputra defeating the heretics, Jianghua Bianwan. There are a few actual scrolls of paintings that were perhaps used for oral storytelling, but we can hardly ever match up a particular scene with a particular line or set of lines from a text. Most of the times all we have are texts that don't have matching paintings or paintings that don't have matching texts. So the precise connection remains pretty hard to draw. Do you want to add to that at all? No?
Do you follow?
Well, I have another question. Yeah, I was very grateful for your presentation, especially with regard to the visual impact of the transmigration, turning like the beings of the sixth path turning into each other, or the animals turning into animals through the barrel, the animals turning into men, or men turning into animals. Could you elaborate on the possible transmigrations among the six paths, like for instance, the gods turn into humans, or asuras turning into humans, or vice versa? Thank you.
That happens all the time, and Buddhist popular literature, I would call it, is filled with stories about those transformations. Usually that occurs only in death, and then you get reborn in the next life. And of course, because we enter life ignorant, devoid of knowledge, we don't know what our past lives have been. So many stories in Chinese literature, Japanese literature, Indian storytelling have to do with explanations of why certain things happen in this life. It's because of good or evil or unusual deeds we committed in a previous lifetime, perhaps as an animal. So the Jataka tales about the previous incarnations of Shakyamuni Buddha, for instance, are largely about his previous incarnation as one kind of animal or another. So that transition is just standard. That is, at the end of life, it's assumed and it's argued and played with that most beings are going to change species in some form. There's going to be a transition from one of the six paths to another. And occasionally, if you do something really bad,